Hey everyone, welcome to our midweek reflection for Wednesday, the 3rd of March. And the passage I am looking at this morning is from John 60, beginning at verse 60 to the end. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones that did not believe and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." Jesus answered them, "Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he, though one of the 12, was going to betray him. Thanks be to God for his word. Well, this is quite a confusing passage, really, when you take the whole of this passage, not just this little bit that we've had today. But we can break it down a little bit. Wherever Jesus went, he drew large crowds. And when we talk of Jesus's disciples, we must remember that we're not just talking about the group of 12, because all those who follow Jesus are potentially his disciples. They're followers and learners, aren't they? And this conversation that Jesus has with his disciples follows on from the miracle he performed earlier with the feeding of the 5,000. And the reason for the confusion and the upset begins a little bit further back than what we've read this morning, from verse 31, when the people bring up the subject of Moses and the manna in the desert, manna from heaven, that their ancestors ate. And Jesus tells them at that stage quite plainly, "It was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it was my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." So Jesus is saying, "I am the true bread from heaven," isn't he? But the crowds then go on to ask for this bread from heaven, and with that, they want Jesus to perform another miracle for them. It wasn't enough that he fed the 5,000 once, they want to see another miracle. And Jesus isn't simply into performing tricks to convince people of who he is. So instead, he tells them that he is the bread of heaven, that in order for us to have life, we must feed on him. For his body is the bread and his blood is the wine. And that is shocking for them to hear. And many, it seems, are offended by it. Many today are offended by it because they don't really understand what Jesus is saying here. And so many people, crowds, decide at this point that they've had enough and it's just too much, and they decide to leave. They walk away from Jesus. They no longer want to follow him or to be his disciples. Excuse me. And I guess that there are several reasons for them deciding to walk away. The first one, I think, is that some left Jesus because he challenged what they believed. Jesus says, "The manna supplied in the desert to your ancestors was not the true bread from heaven. I'm the true bread." Now, these are people who've been brought up with the stories of Moses and their ancestors. And so it must have seemed, therefore, as if Jesus was trashing their ancestral stories. He was running roughshod over what they believed. And that's a challenge for us today as well. For us who only want to acknowledge the Bible as a remarkable historical record and Christianity as a purely spiritual thing. For them, it doesn't matter really if the things Jesus did happened or not. All that matters is simply the message that the passage conveys on how we should live. And I have met people who are prepared to try and follow the teachings of Jesus because they see in them some wisdom for life, but they've no time for the person of Jesus himself. They've no relationship with him. And secondly, I think that some left because Jesus wasn't prepared to tickle their fancy by doing another miracle. For them, perhaps they saw him just as another kind of magician or something. Jesus knows that some people are only following him for what they can get out of him, for what he can do for them. They want another free meal. And when Jesus refuses, they turn away. And so the challenge for us here comes in the same way. Are we prepared to still follow Jesus when things don't go our way, when we don't get what we want, when we hit hard times? Or are we just fair weather Christians who stick around only for as long as we can get something out of it? And thirdly, I think that the whole conversation about eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood was just far too confusing for them and a step too far, because now they are really offended. Had Jesus lost the plot? In this sense, they were perhaps either taking his words too literally, or they understood what Jesus did mean, and it was far too costly for them to contemplate. They were simply not prepared to pay the price of following him any longer. We see that when Jesus says to them, "Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life." So again, this is Jesus' answer to them. He is claiming to have come from heaven, come down from heaven. He is the Word made flesh. And so they obviously cannot accept that Jesus is the Son of God, God with skin on, God in the flesh, the one sent from heaven. They need the Spirit, not only to help them understand what Jesus is saying and teaching, but they need the life of the Spirit in them. And this is what Jesus is really getting at here. It's not enough to be good people who try to follow the teachings of Jesus, because what Jesus is actually offering us is himself, not a philosophy, not a way of living. He's offering us himself. We are to live our lives in him and he in us. We need to live a spirit-filled life, to participate fully in the life of Jesus through the indwelling Spirit. And that is what it means to eat his flesh and drink his blood. So I guess this passage leaves us asking questions of ourselves and of our walk with God. And the questions that we ask ourselves from this passage is at what point might I turn away from Jesus? What would make me walk away from him? Because that is what Jesus asked the 12 when the crowds started to disappear. He said, "And what about you? What about you? Do you also want to leave now?" So that's the first question. What would it take for me to walk away from Jesus? What would make me walk away? And the second question it raises for us is this: am I living life in the Spirit or just following a religion? Am I living life in the Spirit or just following a religion? Does the Spirit of God dwell in me fully? Or am I just trying to be a good person by following the teachings of Jesus? So maybe these are the questions that we might ponder a little more deeply this week from this passage. I'll leave that with you. Thanks for listening. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now. God bless.